Welcome to the Journal of the Southwest Radio podcast, a production of the University of Arizona Southwest Center in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences. I'm Jeff Bannister. I'm speaking today with Dr. Laurel Bellante, Assistant Professor of Practice and Director of the Food Studies degree in the University of Arizona School of Geography, Development, and Environment, and Assistant Director of the Center for Regional Food Studies. Dr. Bellante is a geographer whose research and teaching focus on food justice, food systems, and global environmental change. Bellante lived and worked in the southern Mexican state of Chiapas for 6 years before returning to the U.S. to pursue master's and doctoral degrees in human environmental geography. Her research centered on small-scale Chiapas corn farmers struggling with a changing climate and neoliberal economic policies. Dr. Bellante teaches several undergraduate courses, from an introduction to critical food studies to food justice, ethics, and activism. She also co-leads the university's Food Systems Research Lab with Dr. Gigi Owen, staff scientist with climate assessment for the Southwest. I'm speaking with Dr. Bellante about Southern Arizona's food system, which she has studied and advocated for since 2011. We also talk about her work in southern Mexico and tie it back to the U.S. Southwest. I hope you enjoy this fascinating conversation, and I thank you for tuning in to the JSW Radio podcast. We are truly grateful for your support. Dr. Bellante, welcome to Journal of the Southwest Radio.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I want to start off by asking you to sort of help me understand in broad strokes the structure of the food system in Southern Arizona. A small question, I know. And and also, actually, you could also touch on the idea of a system itself. You know, whether or not that actually is a useful way to describe what might be just a bunch of networks. But maybe you could just help orient us in terms of in broad strokes, what the Tucson or Southern Arizona food system is like.
Okay, yes, massive question. I will do my best. So some of the just kind of orienting features would be to think that here we are talking in Tucson, which we're about an hour north of the border, which is we're situated on one of the largest superhighways of food being transported from primarily Mexico, but even further south, coming up through the terrestrial port of entry in Nogales, and then coming up through Rio Rico, where there's a whole system of brokerage houses where fresh produce is then distributed into other trucks and sent out to supermarkets all over the US and even Canada. So there is a just incredible amount of food being moved through this region. And then also a lot of food that's being produced. I don't do as much work focused on kind of mass agricultural production, but I do know, for example, here in Pima County, our largest crops are cotton, pecans, wheat, and then there's a lot of alfalfa production and other very water-intensive crops throughout the region. Of course, down in Yuma, the massive lettuce capital of the US, where some incredibly high percentage of our winter greens are grown and harvested during the winter months. And then kind of zooming in more locally, we have a really rich system of local food production and consumption here in and around Metro Tucson, which is a little more related to what I do. Oh, and I should also mention, of course, that we are in a region with large indigenous populations and regions that are indigenous areas. So here in Southern Arizona, we have the Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui tribes. Just the Tohono O'odham reservations itself cover more than 2.8 million acres, which, to give an idea, that's about the size of Connecticut. So very, very large areas of land that are indigenous run. And actually on a state level, 57% of agricultural operations in Arizona are indigenous run. So there's also that dimension of things here as well. Mm-hmm. To your question about what is a food system and what is food systems thinking, do, whether it's helpful or not. I do consider myself to be a food systems researcher. And I say that because food systems is a way of thinking about the interconnections between all of the parts that we rely on to get food from crop to table, and then ultimately whatever is left over to waste, and then back to the earth in some way, or to the atmosphere, as the case may be. So systems thinking is helpful in terms of understanding that there are interconnections that go from the seed, the inputs, water, land, the whole production process, then harvesting, processing, distribution, transportation, and then access, consumption, and again, kind of the end of the circle is waste. And most of the conceptions that you see of a food system are drawn in a circular form, thinking that all of these nodes are interconnected and ultimately influence each other. Mm-hmm. What I would add on top of systems thinking is, so I identify and I'm trained as a political ecologist, and what I think that political ecology then adds an extra very important layer to food systems thinking is that it brings in questions of power and control, and thinking about history and geopolitics, and how all of these dynamics also have really important influence in what our food systems look like, what the possibilities are therein, and to what impact, thinking broadly, kind of the who benefits, who's at risks, and what are the levers that we have to make changes.
Mm-hmm. So we have two big food structures in Southern Arizona. One is the highly globalized kind of food circuit, the food superhighway, bringing foods from Mexico and places like Yuma, large scale production. And then, and highly capitalized, I suspect, in most cases, farms. And then we have a more kind of regionalized local foods system or structure. Does that kind of describe the basic outlines?
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to imagine it. Of course, the reality is much more nuanced and interconnected and messy than that. But yeah, I think for simplicity, that's in broad strokes a nice way to frame it.
Mm-hmm. And so I actually do want to ask you about how they're interrelated, but before that, maybe you could walk us through a little bit of the kind of basic outlines of our regional food structure. How is food being produced? Where? Who benefits from it? Maybe you could layer it with a little of your political ecological understandings of political power and things like that.
Yeah, so there's definitely a range of, and for shorthand, I'm just going to say a local food system to kind of contrast to this larger global food system that we were just discussing. Mm-hmm. There's a range of actors within this, everything from small backyard gardeners to kind of more intensive greenhouse production, some slightly larger producers that produce crops that are consumed locally. So in 2020, right when the pandemic hit, my colleague Gigi Owen and I initiated a rapid assessment of the local food system in Pima County and how it was being impacted, and how people were responding to the impacts of COVID. And yeah, and some of the things that we saw was that even though our local food system is fairly small and certainly not provisioning, a vast majority of the food consumed here. In fact, but that's one of the challenges, right? Is that the vast majority of food calories that are produced in our region actually go out of state and to other places, with the exception of dairy that tends to be kind of more localized circuits of consumption. But the importance of those local food systems was really laid bare during the pandemic. And I always like to say that local food systems are about a lot more than just food. While the food is definitely important, there's all of these dimensions to local food systems that are vital. And those are economic dimensions, social, community, some of the really important things that were highlighted during COVID was just the interrelationships and the history of trust and interconnection between different food system actors here was absolutely vital to our ability to rapidly pivot the systems that were in place to adapt to the unfolding crisis that was COVID. So thinking about, for example, the closures of restaurants and schools, right at a time when all of these farmers already had crops in the ground that were destined to be sold to those institutions. And then with those closures, they had nowhere to send their crops. And so there was this rapid re-engineering that happened on the drop of a hat, basically, to make sure that producers still were able to sell their crops and that food was able to get redistributed to people in need through mutual aid networks, consumers through kind of more direct consumer sales. A lot of people shifted to online platforms to make orders and deliveries. And those are some of the important dimensions of that food system here in Metro Tucson. Mm-hmm. This stands in really stark contrast to the realities lived in more rural parts of Pima County and the ways that other more isolated people did not experience that kind of rapid reaction and were actually subject to a lot higher food insecurity and challenges in rural areas, and particularly on the Tohono O'odham Reservation. I know we conducted some interviews as a part of that research that really demonstrated how, it was just emergency response and figuring out how to get food to people in need and to do so safely when the one grocery store on the Tohono O'odham Nation was basically bought out and just facing these empty store shelves. So wow. Really stark disparities between the urban realities and the more rural and native experiences of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. I think that a lot of times, this is somewhat stereotyping here, but, in the popular sort of imaginary, rural areas are often equated with agriculture and with production, but there are, rural Arizona is vast, and there is a lot of diversity, in terms of, ethnic backgrounds, ethnicities, areas, places. And I know that there are big swaths of, rural Arizona that are not at all connected to agriculture or only remotely. So that it makes sense that there would be a pretty major crisis. And then, of course, the distance that people need to travel to find food.
Yeah, the issue of food access is a really challenging one in rural areas of the state. And one of the challenges that this is something I think about all the time, and I think it's a challenge not just to Southern Arizona, but more broadly, is how we address labor in the food system is this massive, massive challenge. And so part of what I do in the food studies degree and how I teach students is learning about the history of our food system and how it's been literally built upon the exploitation of people on the planet. And this is, going back to colonialism, genocide, incarceration, criminalization of immigrant populations. And we have built this quote unquote cheap food system based on being able to exploit cheap labor, whether that's slave labor or now incarcerated labor or undocumented immigrant populations. And we haven't figured out effective ways to make sure that the people working the land and processing food and bringing it to our tables, whether in restaurants or in grocery stores, we haven't figured out how to make those just livelihoods, even though all of our lives literally depend on those livelihoods. And that very much connects to the realities of rural peoples and the dynamic. And this was a dynamic that was present prior to COVID, but then was amplified, was that, there's not a lot of people being driven into the agricultural workforce in rural regions. It's really challenging to staff to find the labor to do those jobs, because generally it is really harsh conditions. It's oftentimes seasonal, underpaid, lack of benefits. And it's not necessarily farm owners' fault for that, right? They're also scraping by and facing all sorts of challenges, and assessing, kind of making their best guess of how much risk to take on and how much labor they can hire. But it creates this domino effect where it's really challenging for the workforce.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess this in some ways brings us back to the question of the differences and connections between, in broad brushstrokes, the globalized food structure moving through southern Arizona, and then the sort of more localized food structure. In the big globalized food structure, and also in the smaller one, who's making the money?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I mean, certainly with the globalized food system, it's very easy to point towards corporations, the obvious answer of who's really making the money. You look at the corporations now control the inputs and they control the outputs, while farmers are in the middle taking on all of the risk. And so when I say inputs, I'm thinking agrochemicals, seeds, fertilizers, all of that is controlled by a very small handful of corporations. And then the farmers are the ones that take on all the risk of buying those seeds and inputs, hoping for a good crop. And then at the end, once they have their outputs, all of that is then going into processing and retail that is also controlled by highly concentrated corporations. I think at the local level, it's a much more complicated question of kind of who's benefiting. And one of the dynamics that is really, I think, important to mention here in terms of how it's playing out in Tucson is related to the City of Gastronomy UNESCO designation that the city of Tucson received in 2015. And this designation, right, is to celebrate and highlight the role of food and agriculture in this region. Very much that application was very much kind of staked on claims of us being located in a region with over 4,000 years of agricultural history in this region, based on indigenous and other people of color that have been in this region for hundreds of years, their labor, right? And then bringing that into the current context of all of the different cultures that are here, creating a really vibrant food scene within Metro Tucson. And all of that is very exciting. And I've been involved in different ways within how that has unfolded over time. But one of the big concerns on my radar, and I know on other critical thinkers, is like really this question of, okay, so we have this designation, so then what work is that doing and who is that benefiting? And well, there's been some recent work by some doctoral students that just graduated. Eden Kenke just finished in the School of Geography, Development and Environment. Their work really demonstrates that a lot of that benefit is really going to white and middle upper class populations, largely the consumer class, right? The consumers that have the ability to go and sit at these beautiful restaurants and enjoy a fancy meal based on, local produce that was purchased down the road. And so there's a lot of tensions in that. And I think what I'm interested in is bringing more nuanced. It raises questions of how can local food systems be oriented around serving community, serving work towards more justice versus where do local food systems actually further exacerbate injustices and inequalities, and kind of who benefits. And I think those are still questions that we're considering and trying to think about more critically. And it's challenging because so much of the UNESCO City Gastronomy designation has been really used to brand Tucson as this destination for tourism, as well as this place for, kind of creative types to enjoy living in the desert, and certainly since the pandemic, we've seen just a huge increase in as people have gone into more remote work. Like there's been a lot of relocation to the Tucson area, and a clear evidence of ongoing gentrification happening, and housing, lack of affordable housing. So it's not to say that necessarily the restaurants are killing it either, but I think there's a perception that there's certain people that are benefiting, and then other groups that are just being left out of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it seems like what you're saying really speaks to what you were saying earlier about the need to approach, the food structure as a system, or as a kind of a totality that involves so many different pieces, including, the way that place gets romanticized within food cultures, and that in turn can propel growth. And, growth is both, it can be a boon to cities, but also a real problematic thing as well, especially in Southern Arizona, because we are, we exist in such a tenuous way vis-a-vis the resources that are locally available to sustain our our population, including especially water.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I should have mentioned water earlier. In these conversations about local food, there's always the elephant in the room is like, well, can we even call it local food if it's not based on local water, which here in Pima County, so much of our water is coming from the Colorado River. Mm-hmm. And I've done a lot of thinking about that, and there's no easy answers, but one thing I would say about that is, again, going back to thinking about local food systems as doing a lot more work than just providing food. I think there is a lot of valid arguments to make that we very much need to prioritize local food systems, and that there's many ways to make the case that those systems are deserving of certain scarce water resources more than, for example, alfalfa production that's going to feed hungry cattle in China and other places across Saudi Arabia and other places across the country and the world, that literally taking these resources and removing them completely from their context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's such a need to be able to make nuanced analyses and to be able to share those, and I think, but it's difficult because, not many people have time to really dig in and study the structure of the food, system in any given place. But
absolutely. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Jeff, I just wanted to add one more thing, yeah. Which was, I think that another way that systems thinking is really important is that we can identify when certain actions are really focused on only one or two nodes within that system, and not taking in kind of a more holistic perspective of how interconnected the nodes are. So I think with a lot of the focus in Metro Tucson being on the kind of creative restaurants and elite dining and tourism experiences, it really leaves out the producer experience and the farm workers and the rest of the service workers, and just kind of assumes, I think is based on some assumptions that demand will automatically create a supply, but that's really challenging when you're not doing work to address inequalities in land and water access, as well as the general trends towards an aging farmer population, which is the reality. Arizona's one of the states in the nation with the worst replacement rate for farmers. And what I mean by that is that we have 5 times more farmers that are 65 or older compared to farmers that are 35 years or younger. And so we're getting to this really big challenge in terms of we need to bring more youth into food production and food systems work. And yet there's definitely some valid efforts underway, but not nearly on the scale that we need, especially if we want to continue kind of prioritizing local food for not just for economic development of the region, but also for community well-being and interconnectedness.
Wow, that's a pretty astonishing ratio, that inversion, that kind of age inversion of agricultural labor. What are some other things that you see, based on your COVID era and more recent studies of the region's food structure?
So one of the things that we're working on now in our food systems research lab, which I co-direct with Gigi Owen, is we're trying to leverage research and resources from the university to support local food policy work. And so one of the things that came out in a lot of our interviews during COVID and thereafter was this the importance of interconnections and relationships across the food system, from producers, processors, institutions, consumers, restaurants. Those interconnections are absolutely vital, and yet there's no real body that is holding that space of interconnection and ensuring the kind of a flow of communication and exchange of resources and knowledge. And historically, there's been several efforts. So back in 2011, an initiative by the Southern Arizona Food Bank, together with partners in the College of Public Health, established the Pima County Food Alliance as a food policy council for Pima County. And I served in those early days I served as a leadership council member from 2013 to 2016 and was involved in some really exciting work during that time. We had several subcommittees that were working on different efforts, including advocating for food that's grown in school gardens to be able to be served within school cafeterias, something that previously wasn't allowed under Arizona health codes. Now, thanks to those efforts, that is allowed. Another one of the efforts was to amend the sustainable zoning code of the city of Tucson to permit more urban agricultural production in Metro Tucson, including animal production. And those were all really exciting efforts, but over recent years, for a number of different reasons, that the Pima County Food Alliance its membership has really dropped. And a lot of that has to do with it having been an all-volunteer council from the beginning, with only a couple people that were able to actually have kind of paid staff hours for their participation and their efforts. Mm-hmm. And something that we've been reflecting on is that when you rely on volunteers to kind of chart the path to policy change, it's not diverse, right? Because that automatically limits who's going to participate to people that happen to have the bandwidth and the time and the passion and energy to do that work. Mm-hmm. And that means, largely like single young people with, some amount of privilege, generally white. We are always missing, the voices of farmers themselves, families, people of color, and other, people that are struggling with low income, struggling with hunger, having those voices present in those efforts. So that's all a long preamble to say that that's one of the efforts that we're trying to support right now through our Food Systems Research Lab, is to assess kind of what worked and what didn't with the Pima County Food Alliance in its previous iterations, and what needs to be done now and into the future to make sure that we have a functioning food policy council for our region. And this is important not just for policy change, but again, for the richness of interrelationship that is so crucial to maintaining a local food system, to building out systems that are more just, to raising consciousness about what's working, what's not, and to mutually support each other in the different efforts. Because one thing that's very clear to me is that this is a both and kind of situation, not an either or. Like it's an all hands on deck, and so many different actors within this broad ecosystem that is Tucson's food systems are doing really amazing things. And how much bigger could that be if we have the systems in place to communicate and to share and to grow our visions for what the future could be.
I know that Tucson is the main place that you have looked at food processes, or one of the main places, but I also know that you have done significant work in Mexico. If you could just talk about, your experience and your research in Mexico, and perhaps bring it back around to how that informs what you are interested in the work you're doing in Tucson and Southern Arizona, I think that could be very interesting.
I originally got involved in just really wanting to delve into food studies and thinking about food and culture and environment. The passion goes back further, but really it took on new significance for me in 2010 when I started my master's degree. And when I started graduate school, I was really excited to just be surrounded by all of this intellectual energy. And I'm a total nerd, so I really enjoyed that. But one thing that was really challenging for me was the way that I think, particularly in critical social sciences, we're really good at the critique, and we're good at taking apart what's wrong with things, but we have a much harder time at kind of building things and transforming things, other than saying, well, this isn't the way to do it. And so when I was choosing a topic for my master's research, I decided that I wanted to focus on food and food producers, not more than anything because while I don't know what the answers to all of our problems are, I know that there is no sustainable future without sustainable and just food systems. And so I wanted to focus on efforts underway, kind of safeguard what has been successful, and then kind of chart the path forward for different systems. And so for my master's research, I focused on these emerging organic, for lack of a better word, I'll say farmers markets, even though, well, in Mexico, they talk about tianguis orgánicos, these kind of organic networks of organic farmers and artisanal producers. And I was really interested in just understanding how this was unfolding in the Mexican context and how it compared to other regions where these kind of farmers market, local food systems had really become this really popular wave of among different thinkers and actors. So what I found there was, looking at the case of Chiapas, was that, as is the case here, so many of the people doing this work, first and foremost, they're doing it out of passion for their place, for their culture, for their community, and it's not about getting rich. That's the one thing that's very clear, is that, and I would say that holds true for both sides of the border. Being a small scale food producer, there's not a lot of upward mobility there, but I think there's a lot of really important work that's being done. There's work that we take for granted that's being done in those spaces. So in the case of Mexico, there is a vast amount of agricultural biodiversity that is in the hands of smallholders. And that is repeated across the globe, right? So I think globally there's something like almost 500 million family farms in the world. And these are repositories of cultural, social, and biological diversity that is absolutely vital. And those systems relate from the diversity of the seed itself to the diversity of the systems of production and the ability to produce a wide variety of crops on a very small plots of land, everything from fruit trees to, the Three Sisters, corn, bean, squash, and these interrelated agroecological systems that are very much like closed loop cycling of nutrients between the animals, the trees, and the crops themselves, all moving in more of a closed loop. And all of that is then intertwined in beautiful ways with language, with culture, with culinary knowledge, with knowledge of just solidarity across peoples, and all of that. I don't want to over romanticize it, because it's oftentimes braided with poverty as well. And so there's immense wealth in terms of knowledge and biodiversity, and then not a lot in terms of material wealth. And there's all of these threats to the maintenance of those systems. And I get emotional because it's for my doctoral research, I focus on corn farmers and how they're experiencing climate change and other environmental changes and how they're responding to that. And in the case of Mexico, it's like 85% of corn is produced by small scale farmers. So that's like 5 hectares or smaller. So very small systems of production, much smaller than what we think about and like grain producers in the US. Mm-hmm. It's just massively industrialized. And, kind of the cold economic analysis of that is like, why are those farmers producing corn? They should be doing something else, like they should be doing kind of high value vegetable production, or planting watermelon, and a lot of the policy changes that have happened over the last 30 years have been really trying to push small farmers out of corn production. Mm-hmm. But my research on this is not groundbreaking. I mean, there's a lot of work prior to my own that really shows like corn is at the heart of sustenance for so many people in Mexico. It continues to be the largest source of calories for low-income populations in Mexico. It's also what farmers know how to do best, and it's also a crop that's incredibly versatile. So you can eat it fresh, you can make it into animal feed, you can try and process it and have it stored in your larder for a whole year until you and process it as you need into tortillas and tamales and all sorts of different uses. Whereas I remember in one of my interviews, someone said, there's only so much watermelon we could eat, right? Like we tried the whole watermelon thing, like those, the technicos, the ag extension guys, they came and they told us, do watermelon. And sure, the first year was great because only a handful of people in the community did watermelon, and they got a really good price, and it was great. But then the next year, word got out, everyone did watermelon, and all of a sudden people's homes, literally their homes, their living rooms are stacked floor to ceiling with watermelon that they can't move. And as that farmer said, there's only so much watermelon we can eat, and there's not a lot of other things that you can do with watermelon as opposed to corn, which just has this versatility. And so I think understanding those the really like human dimensions behind farmer decision making is really critical, and it's something I would say that translates across contexts. The need to just understand the humanity at heart of all of these systems, and similar to kind of bridge it back to the conversation about Arizona. What is very clear from my research in southern Mexico is like climate change is on, right? It's happening now. It's no longer this distant threat. And that was surprising to me because I married into a Mexican family. My husband's from Mexico City. I've been traveling and living in Mexico on and off since 2001. And so it was really surprising to me to see this shift from, talking with farmers back in the early 2000s that would say, if you mentioned climate change, they'd kind of be like, what? Oh, they wouldn't necessarily have an immediate way to kind of locate that term or what significance it has in their lives. And then fast forward to, the 2015, 16, 17, when I was doing my research, everyone was talking about climate change. Like I didn't even have to mention it. And already farmers are saying, this is so challenging. And it goes back to something that I was saying earlier in terms of farmers being squeezed in the middle of these cycles of production in terms of they are the players that are taking on all the risk, right? Because they take out the loans to be able to buy the seeds, buy the fertilizer, pesticides, everything. And then hope that they plant at the right time, that they apply the, herbicides and pesticides at the right time and the fertilizers at the right time to coincide with rain, because a lot of these systems continue to be rain-fed, rain-dependent systems. And then, fingers crossed, they get through and actually have a successful crop at the end that then they can sell. And because of changes in how crops are harvested and sold now in the neoliberal era, those are no longer such guaranteed prices. So there's a lot of price variability as well, even once you have your corn harvested. And so it creates just this real experience of vulnerability in all the senses. And that definitely translates to the experiences here in Southern Arizona, right? And it's not just that things are getting hotter and drier, but then these just dramatic swings in between extremes of precipitation. And so in Southern Mexico, a lot of what farmers are telling me is the rains don't come on the dates that they used to. We used to always plant in April. Now we plant late May, sometimes pushing into June because of that variability in rain. And then it doesn't fall with the rainfall isn't coming in the consistent ways that it used to. And so they would have days and days and days of drought, and then these massive rainstorms and
or hail,
and that has just huge impact in a farmer's ability to be successful. And I think that translates very much to Southern Arizona as well. I was just remembering this morning that in 2020 we had the second hottest and driest year on record in Arizona. Mm-hmm. And then 1 year later, 2021, we had the third wettest monsoon ever recorded locally. Mm-hmm. And so we're going from these extreme hot, dry conditions to these extreme wet. And so that variability is just extremely challenging.
I mean, I know that farming in both of these areas has always been a pretty volatile and changeable affair, but would you say that, for some time at least, farmers had a much more reliable set of conditions within which to operate? And then you mentioned neoliberalism, and I'm just wondering if you could help us understand how the shift in sort of public policy has lends itself to that volatility, that increased volatility.
Sure. Yeah, great questions. So that first question about the uncertainty, I think you can talk to any farmer and they'll just say that farming it's a game of risk, and it's filled with uncertainty. And I think that's been the case from beginning of time. Mm-hmm. But what has shifted, as you indicate with your second part of that question, is the public policy and the knowledge networks that support that production. So in the case of Mexico, there's kind of two big shifts that I will point to that I think are important to understand. The first is the Green Revolution. And I should actually preface this with saying that what I'm about to say plays out very differently depending on the specific farmer's profile. So what I mean by that is where they're located in terms of topography of, if you're a highland farmer that's completely dependent on rainfall, that's going to be a very different experience than if you're a lowland farmer in a fairly fertile region with good soil fertility and access to consistent not only rainfall, but potentially irrigation. This plays out very differently. So with that, to preface it, so the first really big shift that changed how Mexico approaches production really came with the Green Revolution and with the widespread push to get farmers to adopt hybrid seeds. So these are not genetically engineered seeds, but seeds that have qualities that have been engineered through field trials to be highly productive. It kind of, in the case of corn, makes for a highly productive corn, but that it's a seed that cannot be saved and then reliably produce a crop thereafter. And so this is based on science that, Norman Borlaug, right down the road here in Sonora, a lot of that research was started in Sonora and back in the 1940s, 50s. Mm-hmm. And that absolutely transformed the whole approach to agriculture and put us into what a lot of people call like this productivist time of agricultural production that's just really about like getting the most crop per drop, and it goes matched with highly intensive irrigation as well as extreme chemical intensive inputs of fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides. So it becomes this whole technological packet that farmers have to rely on, whereas prior to that, they were in the practice of saving seeds, managing their soil fertility, doing a lot of rain-based agriculture. So that's the first shift. And that first shift was really based on a lot of public policy that that funded seed science, that funded, that actually gave out those seeds and those tech packets to farmers to kind of encourage them to make this change. But then fast forward to the 80s, 90s, and now up through the 2000s, 2023, what year are we now? The last 40 years, those policies have now been further transformed by what a lot of people refer to as neoliberalism. Some people call it free market capitalism. And in the U.S., a lot of people are aware of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which eliminated a lot of the kind of rules around agricultural trade between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, and it had a big impact in how corn was bought and sold between countries, creating a huge flow of corn to be exported from the U.S. to Mexico. But that's really just one part of the story. A lot of what I found in my research is that, yes, that's certainly the kind of opening of those grain markets has increased a certain amount of vulnerability for farmers, but it's all of the other things that have transformed around that. And so what I'm referring to there is the removal of public support of seed science and extension support and inputs subsidies, as well as subsidies for ensuring a minimum price once farmers actually have their grain at production. So that the stripping, it's the combination of stripping all of those policies away and that kind of systems of support that has created it's just amplified 1,000 times the experience of vulnerability and uncertainty that farmers face.
Mm-hmm. So you spend decades constructing a whole agricultural system based on the idea of increased yields and exporting crops for capital, for cash, including guaranteed prices. And I know, this extended over the entire Republic of Mexico, Sonora for sure. Much of the wealth of the state of Sonora was built on guaranteed prices for wheat and to a far lesser degree corn. All right. And then you're saying there, all of that stuff, the rug was basically pulled out from under all of that.
Yeah. And what really surprised me, because so much of my time in Chiapas, I historically lived and worked in the highlands region where it's very micro scale agriculture, rain-fed agriculture. And I had not really spent such extended time in these lowland farm areas. I was absolutely blown away by the extent to which those policy changes had just opened the door for these massive corporations to get a foothold. Even as far away as southern Mexico, Chiapas, some of the most isolated places. And now you drive around and you see these massive billboards of Monsanto, now Bayer, right now controlled by Bayer, DuPont, which has also been merged. There's been so many mergers between these corporations, but basically there's 4 or 5 corporations that are absolutely dominating the whole agricultural industry now. And so when farmers are facing these challenges of not knowing when to plant, how to even understand all of the changes that are going on, their most available source of expertise turns out to be like a Monsanto official, and that automatically means that farmers are driven towards a certain set of solutions, oftentimes encouraging purchasing of additional inputs and other kinds of things that can, in the hopes of salvaging their crop and whatnot. But over time, it adds up to soil degradation, increased pest challenges, and then oftentimes, if the weather is not amenable to how they've planted that season, they can be looking at total loss, then unable to pay their debts, and then from there, it can be a process of what we call dispossession, of not being able to practice farming anymore and having to turn to either migration to urban areas or to the US, to transitioning from land ownership to then renting out that land or even having to sell it. And so it has this domino effect that really destabilizes rural Mexico and has all sorts of impacts, all the way through to our side of the border here, in Arizona.
In terms of people being pushed out and migrating into the U.S.
Yeah.
And I definitely noticed it. So I first started going to Sonora when, mid 1990s. And if I think back on my earliest experiences, then, and then going back now. So I was recently in Sonora in April, and I was in rural areas that I've known for a long time. And, it's a very distinct feel. I mean, this is it's not just impressionistic, because I was talking to old friends, people I've known for a long time. And, a lot of places that I've known for a lot of years have a very abandoned feel to them.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't crops in the field. The houses in many places are boarded up, and trees that in their yards that, would have been watered are dying. I mean, it's a rather apocalyptic, in some places of Sonora, at least, it's a rather apocalyptic kind of feel.
Yeah, indeed, that outmigration is very real, and the impacts of that. And, Mexico is also facing a challenge of agricultural workforce. And interestingly enough, I'll mention this because I was also surprised when I learned this, actually, when I started visiting Sonora when I moved to Tucson in 2010. I hadn't realized how, just as we have circuits of migratory farm labor here in the US, Mexico has the same, right? And so many of the large scale fields of melons and squash and tomatoes and all of these things that we enjoy as imports to the US, exports from Mexico, are being harvested by migrant labor that's coming up from southern Mexico, oftentimes from indigenous areas where that have been extremely hard hit by these transitions and inabilities to find other forms of income that don't rely on them having to migrate. And so that was a surprising thing to see.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about those kinds of demographics in Chiapas?
Historically, they're really, since Spanish conquest and colonization, the large plantations that were established from that time, even though there has been certainly a lot of, after the Mexican Revolution and the Reforma Agraria, there was a significant redistribution of land resources, but a lot of that large scale land ownership continues. And so even prior to modern era, if you will, those plantations were always based on exploited labor coming from, oftentimes from highland regions, from indigenous regions. And those dynamics continue through today. There are a lot of what you just described in terms of those migratory populations that also exist to a certain extent in southern Mexico, certainly in coffee plantations. things like that. When it comes to kind of smaller scale corn production, it typically is more local labor, and that's also become a bigger challenge as, there's just this exodus of youth from rural areas. And so whereas, I think 30 years ago, people could make, I don't want to say a just living necessarily, but they could make a living being farm laborers, and they'd have a certain amount of food security. I think the shifts are such that insecurity has gotten to a level where if a young person can, they generally will leave the rural areas. And so there's also a big struggle for manual labor within the agricultural systems in southern Mexico. And I don't know what to say about that. It's really complicated, and I think it's delicate for me as a white woman of privilege, working in an educational institution, to necessarily advocate that we should do something to protect those jobs and those livelihoods, because it's really hard labor. But I also know from what I've researched and read that going full large scale monoculture industrialized system is not working either. So it's a big challenge that I think we need a lot of creative minds and inspiration to put our heads together and think about how do we make changes that allow for people to have just livelihoods and to live off the land in ways that feel good and that are healthy and supportive. And I think a part of that answer is thinking about kind of small is beautiful, right? Like adjusting technology and interventions to match the users themselves and the places and the people, rather than kind of asking the landscapes and the people to just adapt to the technology, if that makes sense. And the answer is not going to be the same for any person, right? I think it's totally valid that people that have the perspective of, agricultural labor is drudgery, and the sooner we get rid of it, the better. Like I could totally understand that viewpoint, but I also know from my experience talking to hundreds of farmers around the world, and there's also a real dignity and a real passion and a real beauty of connection to place, and a commitment to land, commitment to family and community, and to knowledge that is valued by certain people. And so I think that that's worth remembering as well. It's really I think it's a broad spectrum of perspectives about that. And I will say, in my interviews with corn farmers, a lot of them, I did ask kind of, well, what do you hope for, with your kids' generation? And people would generally say, I want them to know how to do it, but I don't want them to ever have to do it. And, if they can go on and get jobs in the city, all the better for them. At this point, so many rural families in Mexico really rely on at least one family member who's migrated to the city or to the US, and that's able to send resources home. But there's also just this fierce defense of rural livelihoods as well. And I think that feels different in Mexico because, people are still alive that remember the Mexican Revolution, that remember how hard their grandparents and great-grandparents fought to have their piece of land. And so there's a resistance to letting that go. And something that I think about here in kind of my world, my context, is I try to practice a lot of critical self-reflection and how I go about my work and the questions that I ask. And one thing that's clear to me, I became a mother a few years ago, and have been reflecting a lot about just like, what's the future I want for my kids, and what are kind of the like really important things that I want to make sure to impart to them. And high on that list is a connection with the earth. And I would never sit here and say that we all need to become backyard gardeners or farmers in any sense of the word, but I do think that there's real scientific evidence to back this up, right? That like, we need a connection to the earth. And for most people, eating food every day is our most direct connection to the earth. And there is so much that is really damaged and hurt right now in that relationship. And there's so much that can be healed through different practices. And there's I listened to an interview with this author, Lucy Jones, who wrote this book, Losing Eden. And she talks about this nature deficit disorder. Like, it's literally, the science bears out our need to be in touch with the natural world. And I think that food production will always be a part of how we can do that. A lot of the challenges we faced are gigantic, and they can feel, they're these wicked problems, right? These grand challenges. And that's when I feel that sense of overwhelm, I try to take a pause and take a deep breath and go look outside, or remember, take a moment to just appreciate the good work that's being done by colleagues here at the university, friends here in the community, friends and families in Mexico and beyond that are doing this work, and it makes me remember, it's the effort of many that will make the change. And I love to invoke one of the quotes by Adrienne Marie Brown, who's a social movement thinker, activist, who says that justice work is science fiction work, because we're doing the labor of inventing a future in a world that does not yet exist. And that quote always just helps center me and help me remember that, justice is the horizon, and we're all going to keep moving towards it, because it's really going to be the only way that we're going to get out of this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a really great place to end it. I will also just add, thank you for all the great work that you're doing, Laurel. It's been pretty amazing to see you evolve in your role as a researcher and a teacher. I've known you for a long time, and I really cherish our conversations and our connections, with Mexico and other things. So thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you, Jeff.